It was late, much later than I had ever driven alone, and Daniel was at home, likely working late again. The glow of his laptop was the only light in our bedroom most nights, and I tried not to think about his face because it was so exhausted that he hardly looked at me anymore unless it was to ask about dinner or the other important things. Hello, everyone. I couldn't remember the last time I felt like I was on the verge of something exciting and terrifying. The car hummed under me, and the kids were sleeping in the back seat. I knew Nina's door was always open, a place where I could shed the heavy coat of responsibility I wore at home. Her house was a contrast to chaotic, full of music and laughter, even when it was just the two of them. It wasn't that we fought or had screaming matches like some couples, but rather that the silence was suffocating the way we became like roommates passing each other with a polite smile, but never really seeing each other tonight. Was unorthodox. They never feigned to be a perfect couple. They had rules, of course, but there was an openness and freedom about them that I kind of envied. I parked outside and stared at the glow from her living room window. The kids were asleep, so I stayed in the car for a little while longer, the silence enveloping me like a blanket. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat, and I looked down at it. Daniel's name lit up the screen. I ignored it. He would ask me where I was, and I would lie, but it wasn't a big lie. I needed a night out at Nina's. It wasn't completely false, but it wasn't the whole truth either. I gathered the kids and carried them into Nina's spare room one by one, tucking them in under the thick quilt she kept on the bed. By the time I sat down on her couch with a glass of wine in my hand, I felt the tension in my shoulders begin to decrease. "Rough night?" she asked, sinking into the seat next to me. Her smile was knowing. Swirling the wine in my glass, I said, "I'm a little sad, just need a break." She didn't press me, and I appreciated that. Instead, she turned up the music, a soothing jazz tune that filled the room like a sigh. I leaned back, resting my head against the cushion, and closed my eyes for a moment. The wine was warm on my tongue, slowly heating my body. "You know," Mina said, "it's okay to want more, Riley." When I opened my eyes, I saw her staring at me with that piercing gaze, as if she could see right through me. She snorted. "Sure, you have a husband who works 80 hours a week, kids who need you every second of the day, and a house that's like a Gana museum. Is that what you always wanted?" I started, but she held up her hand and said, "I'm not judging you, Riley. I'm just saying it's okay to want something different. You don't have to follow the script. Look at me and Marcus, we do things our way. Her way wasn't my way. Didn't require that kind of freedom and chaos. But a small voice inside of me said, what if you do?" We talked about movies, trivial topics, the newest rumors, and our neighbors' ridiculous antics for the remainder of the night. But her words stuck in my head long after I left her place and drove home. In the early morning, when I slipped back into bed beside Daniel, he didn't wake up, so I lay there staring at the ceiling and listening to the gentle sound of his breathing, which I used to find reassuring, but now it felt like. I turned on my side, away from him, and pulled the blanket up to my chin. The following morning, Daniel was up like everyone else, wearing his pressed shirt and tie, and he kissed my cheek. The gesture was so automatic that it hardly registered. I watched him leave the room, wondering if he noticed the slight change in me, the tiny crack that had begun to form, but if he did, he said nothing. The first spark was a week later when Na called her voice. When I told Daniel, he barely looked up from his laptop and said, "Have fun?" I could feel the resentment rising, but I forced it down because this was what I wanted, and I didn't have to feel bad when Mina arrived. She looked like she was ready for a party, her dress clinging to her curves, her makeup flawless. I was bursting with excitement over the phone. "I'm taking you out tonight, no arguments. Now I can't just you can, and you will all be at your place at 8. I barely had time to object before she hung up. I, on the other hand, felt as though I had thrown myself together in a hurry. She took one look at me and pulled me back upstairs, saying, "You're not going out like that." She then went through my closet and took out a dress I hadn't worn in years, one that I had purchased before the kids were born. It was black and tight in all the right places, making me look somewhat like the woman I used to be. We ended up at a bar that I had never been to before, a place where Daniel wouldn't be caught dead. It was noisy, crowded, and the air was heavy with the smell of sweat. When we pushed our way to the bar, Na ordered shots without asking, and as she clinked her glass against mine and said, "Here's to freedom," I laughed. The sound surprised me, and I couldn't recall the last time I had laughed so much, not out of politeness, but because I felt it. The night had faded into a haze of music and laughter, and I was dancing with a stranger when I felt a familiar presence, a pair of eyes on me. I turned, and there he was, Alex, and for a moment I didn't plan on seeing Alex because he was a memory from a life I thought I'd left behind, a piece of my past I'd neatly packed away, but life has a funny way of pulling the threads you thought you'd cut that night at the bar with No. I felt like I was walking through a dream, one of those surreal moments where everything feels heightened, the colors more vivid, the laughter louder, perhaps because of the alcohol. I couldn't breathe. He hadn't changed. It was like seeing a ghost I wasn't prepared for, but instead I smiled, and he smiled back. Or the freedom of being away from Daniel and the kids for a change, but when I turned to see Alex sitting at the end of the bar, it was like a shock of electricity went through me. He hadn't changed much. The same mischievous smile, the same easy confidence that had drew me to him all those years ago. He looked up from his drink, and for a moment his eyes widened in surprise. Then that familiar smirk curved his lips, and I felt my heart skip a beat. It was as if no time had passed at all. "Riley," he said, raising his glass in A. He told me about his life, how he had moved back to town a few months ago, started a new job, and how he was surprised to find himself sitting in this bar tonight. I laughed and told him that he was surprised to find himself sitting in this bar tonight, but I couldn't help but smile. "You're still as cheesy as ever," I replied, sliding onto the stool next to him. It felt natural and easy in a way I hadn't felt in years. I could have given a straightforward response, but the truth was exploding inside of me, desperate to come out. Perhaps it was the wine loosening my tongue, or perhaps it was the way he looked at me as if I were still the woman he knew, not the weary wife and mother I had become. I needed a break. I finally said, the words sounding hollow even to my ears. This wasn't my typical scene, and he raised an eyebrow. That smirk deepened. As the night wore on, the crowd in the bar thickened the noise, rising to a dull roar, and I felt lighter and more free than I had in a long time. He gave me a look that seemed to see right through me. I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out. What could I say to Daniel and the kids from the life I built that felt like a cage now? I shrugged and took another sip of my drink, hoping the alcohol would burn away the tightness in my chest. He leaned closer, lowering his voice, and said, "You still have it in you, Riley. I can see it. You just need to let it out." It sent a chill down my spine, as if he were reaching into my chest and pulling out something I had buried for a long time. "I'm the furthest thing from wild these days," he said, his eyes softening as he looked at me. "I'm the wild one," he said, laughing about our foolish arguments and laughing about our time lost in the mountains. Before I realized what was happening, we were leaning in closer, and I could smell the faint trace of his cologne, feel the warmth of his breath on my skin, and my heart was pounding. For a moment, I forgot everything Daniel, the kids, and the life I was supposed to be living. I met his eyes a while ago, and the air between us crackled with something dangerous that I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't love, not even lust, not entirely. Promise of something different, and then I kissed him. It wasn't a gentle, hesitant kiss. Rather, it was a hungry, desperate kiss that felt like stepping off a cliff and letting go of everything that was holding me back. The taste of him was familiar and intoxicating, and I didn't want it to end, but it did. The kiss broke like glass when a hand grabbed my arm and yanked me back, and I staggered, almost falling off the stool and looking up into Daniel's face. I tried to free my arm, but Daniel's grip only made it tighter. I hissed, but he wasn't listening. He was staring daggers at Alex, who looked as shocked as I did. "Why have you been acting so distant? Is this what you've been hiding?" Daniel's voice was louder now, attracting the attention of those nearby. I could feel the heat. He was furious, his eyes burning with a fury I'd never seen before, and his jaw clenched so tightly that I thought his teeth might break. I felt a mixture of embarrassment and anger rise in my face as I yanked my arm free and took a step back. "You tracked my phone," and I spat my voice sharply. "You're damn right I did," and he shot back. I've been sitting at home wondering what's going on with you, and now you're kissing your ex in a diet bar." His words were hurtful, but they also ignited a fire inside of me. I could feel the resentment I'd been suppressed for years erupting. Perhaps I wouldn't have to be here if you had given me more attention instead of your fucking spreadsheets. Out of me before I could stop them for a moment. The entire bar seemed to go silent, with everyone watching us as if we were the main attraction. I saw Daniel's hurt briefly before he reacted angrily, saying, "You feel trapped in a life I've been working my AOU's guess off to give you?" I didn't have an answer, and I couldn't even look at him. Instead, I turned and ran, my heart pounding as I heard him call my name, but I didn't stop because I had to leave. He didn't return home that night, and the following morning he was back sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee in front of him, his face drawn and exhausted. I drove aimlessly for hours, the city lights blurring past me as I tried to digest what had just happened. When I finally pulled into our driveway, the house was dark, and I crept inside half expecting Daniel to be there waiting to yell at me again. But the living room was empty, his car gone, and he didn't come home. We just stared at each other for a long time, and I could see the pain and confusion in his eyes. He opened his mouth to say something, but I said, "I'm sorry," and I whispered. He nodded slowly, but it was resignation rather than acceptance. "We needed to talk," he said flatly, and we spent hours discussing everything we had been avoiding for years, how far apart we had become, and how we had allowed our marriage to fall into a rut. That night, we made promises to try harder to be better for a while. It almost felt like things might actually change. We went on dates once more and spent more time together. Daniel tried to leave work early, and I tried to meet him halfway. However, even as we laughed and held hands like we used to, I couldn't stop thinking about that kiss about Alex and how I felt when we were together. At first, it was just a slight itch, but it kept getting worse and eating away at me. I knew I was slipping even as Daniel tried to hold on to me, and the worst part was that I couldn't find it in myself to stop the kiss. The days after the incident at the bar were a blur of hushed apologies and cautious steps, like walking on broken glass. Daniel and I talked for hours longer than we had in years, as if we were trying to bandage a wound that needed stitches, but we were desperate enough to think it might work. We made promises that Daniel would work less, and I would be more present, and we would find a way to rediscover the parts of ourselves that needed to be stitched. With Alex, it wasn't just a mistake. It was a door I had cracked open, and I couldn't seem to close it. He took me out to restaurants and other places we used to visit before the kids arrived, and life became a series of routines. We even went for a weekend together, just the two of us, and we laughed and held hands like we used to. When we made love, it felt tender, almost desperate, like we were clinging to something slipping through our fingers, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't get that night out of my head. The kiss with Alex lingered like the inevitable aftertaste of strong wine. I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't help but crave that feeling again. Daniel saw how I would nod off during our conversations, my eyes unfocused, as if I were somewhere else. He tried to pull me back to remind me of the life we were creating together, but the harder he pulled, the further I felt myself slipping away. To forget it wasn't just the kiss, though. It was what it represented. The way he made me feel like someone else, someone who wasn't trapped by the expectations of being a wife and mother. I called Nina one evening after another tense dinner, where we pretended everything was fine. I needed someone who wouldn't judge me and who knew what it was like to want more than what you were given. "You need a night out," she said without hesitation. "Come meet me at the bar. I'll be there in an hour." I agreed before I even gave it any thought. The moment I hung up, the guilt hit me, but I pushed it down because I couldn't continue living this half-life stuck between who I was and who I was. My heart skipped a beat when I saw Alex sitting next to her, his eyes already on me as if he'd been waiting, and he gave me that lopsided grin that made me feel like the most interesting person. I was supposed to be at the bar, and the familiar dim lighting and the throb of music against my chest felt like a relief, like stepping into a different world where I could breathe again. I spotted Nina at the back, her bright smile and carefree laugh drawing me in like a beacon. "You look like you could use a drink," Alex said, sliding a glass towards me. I took it without saying anything, the burn of the liquor soothing the raw edges of my nerves. We fell into conversation easily, the three of us laughing like old friends. I felt the tension in me easing, replaced by a light I hadn't felt in months. For a moment, I hesitated, the memory of our kiss rushing back with startling clarity, but then I pushed forward, taking the seat across from them. The music seemed to fade away as Alex leaned closer and searched my eyes. "I've been thinking about you," he said in a low voice, and I swallowed the heat rising in my cheeks. "Alex, we shouldn't." I know, he interrupted with a mischievous glint in his eye, "but I have an idea, something wild, something I think you need." The way he said it, as if he already knew I would say yes, sent a shiver down my spine. I should have remembered how everything went wrong the last time, but instead I leaned closer, curious about what kind of idea he had. He looked around the room, then lowered his voice even more. "I've been wanting to do this for a while, and I think you're the right person for it. It's risky, but it's the kind of risk that makes you feel alive." My heart raced, and I felt the familiar thrill of danger running through me. "Alex, what are you talking about?" He hesitated, as if he was considering whether or not to tell me. Then leaning back, a slow smile spread across his face, he said, "I want to make a video, something intimate with me and a few friends." I stared at him, waiting for the words to sink in. I echoed, my voice barely above a whisper, and he nodded, his eyes never leaving mine. "Riley, I promise you, and 3 of my friends and I would be in the VIP room, and no one would know because it would be our secret. It would be the most liberating experience of your life, and I feel a mix of fear and excitement." I should have said no, laughed it off, made up an excuse and left, but instead I found myself nodding, the adrenaline already pumping through my veins. I couldn't even explain it to myself. It was like I was watching someone else make the decision, someone who looked like me but wasn't bound by the same rules. "That's what you need?" he asked softly, something crazy, something different. "You've been living this perfect little life for so long. Don't you want to break free just for one night?" Shaky but certain, his smile widened, and he reached for my hand, pulling me to my feet. "You won't regret this, Riley." I let him lead me through the crowded bar, my pulse thewing in my ears. He guided me towards the back, past the velvet rope that separated the VIP section from the rest of the room. The bouncer barely glanced at us as Alex whispered something in his ear, and then we were inside, the door closing behind us with a soft click. The room was dimly lit, plush couches lining the walls. 3 men I didn't recognize were already. When we walked in, they were sitting there casually, as if they had been waiting. When we walked in, their eyes swept over me with a mix of interest and curiosity. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could hear a voice in my head telling me to turn around and leave before it was too late, but I stayed. Alex pulled me in, his hand warm on the small of my back, his lips brushing against my ear. He whispered, "Just trust me, this will be worth it," and despite my better judgment, I allowed myself to be drawn into the whirlwind. The camera flashed on, and I felt a rush of adrenaline like I hadn't experienced in years. I couldn't stop reliving the events of the previous night, even as the morning sun pierced the windshield on my drive home. I felt as though I was floating outside of my own body, disconnected, as if the person who had made those decisions wasn't really me. Things were blurring into a haze of desire and the need to feel anything other than the crushing weight of my everyday life. My heart pounded in my chest, not from excitement anymore, but from a creeping realization that I had stepped into a void from which there was no return. The low laughter and the thrill of crossing that invisible line I'd been towing for so long felt like rebellion, like shaking off a heavy chain I'd been dragging behind me for years. The voices in the back of my mind were a chorus of doubts, each one louder than the last. "What have you done?" they whispered, echoing in the car's silence. I was caught in a trap, but I forced it down because I wasn't yet ready to face the consequences. When I pulled into the driveway, the house was as quiet and motionless as I had left it. The quiet exterior felt like a lie, hiding the chaos that was about to happen inside. I slowly opened the door, trying to act normal, but as soon as I entered, I realized it was too late. Daniel was sitting at the kitchen table, the early light casting long shadows across his face. He wasn't dressed for work, just an old t-shirt and sweatpants like he. His hands were clasped in front of him, his knuckles white as if he were holding himself together by sheer willpower. His eyes met mine, and I saw a look in them that I had never seen before, a mix of betrayal, disbelief, and a kind of heartbreak that made my chest tighten. I opened my mouth and forced a smile, saying, "I didn't feel you're up early." My voice was hollow, and the words stuck to the roof of my mouth. He didn't return the smile, and at first he just stared at me as if he was looking for a sign of the woman he had left behind. The bar owner, who was obviously Daniel's friend, and someone I had never even considered, called me last night. I knew that when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost broken. The words hit me like a slap, and I felt the ground drop out from under me. Daniel's pulse thundered in my ears. In the heat of the moment, he must have seen everything and must have picked up the phone the moment I left. The realization sank into my stomach like a stone. Heavy and cold. "Daniel." I began speaking shakily, but it's not what you think. He cut me off standing. I heard everything and saw the pictures of Riley. Suddenly, the chair scraped against the floor. I don't think he laughed, but it was only bitterness. "How can you stand there and lie to me like this?" I felt a wave of panic that was quickly followed by anger. I hadn't expected this to be a confrontation, but not like this, and I needed him to yell to give me something to fight against because the quiet destruction in his eyes was too much to handle. "Who the hell do you think you are? You've been following me, haven't you?" He reacted as though I had slapped him, and his voice cracked with a raw kind of pain I hadn't heard before. "Are you serious, Riley?" I shouted back the words that were tumbling out before I could stop them. I needed to shift the blame so that I felt like I had some control over the spiraling mess I'd created. "You pushed me away, Daniel. You made me feel invisible for years. Now that you have the audacity to pretend to be the victim," the accusation hung heavy between us. I saw the hurt briefly flash across his face before it was replaced by a distant, icy look that I didn't recognize. It seemed as though he had withdrawn behind a wall, insulating himself from the pain. Riley said, "You cheated on me," in a low voice, "and even you betrayed me. Rather than accept responsibility, you're standing here attempting to place the blame on me." I opened my mouth to argue, to level another accusation at him. But "I didn't have to explain myself to you," I whispered, turning away, unable to look at him any longer. He laughed bitterly. "You don't have to explain yourself, that's all you have to say," and I clenched my jaw, refusing to turn around. The truth was there, stark and unquestionable, staring back at me through his eyes. I had betrayed him, and instead of feeling the crushing guilt I expected, there was only a hollow numbness. I said in a low voice, "Maybe it's time for you to go." The words sounded strange even to me, and the silence that followed was oppressive. I half expected him to fight for us, to argue, to demand that I explain, but when I looked back, he was just standing there, staring at me as if he didn't recognize me anymore. "If that's what you want," he said in a hollow voice, and then he turned to leave. As I watched him go, I felt a sharp, twisting pain in my chest that I couldn't quite place. It wasn't regret. Realization that I had won, that I had pushed him away like I wanted, but instead of feeling free, I felt like I was sinking. He paused at the door, his hand on the handle for a moment. He looked back, his eyes searching mine one last time. "I loved you, Riley," he said, his voice cracking. "I really did." The door closed behind him, and I was left standing in the empty room, the silence pressing down on me like a weight. I sank down onto the couch, staring blankly ahead. I'd expected to feel a sense of relief, a rush of triumph at finally. I had fought for freedom, CLA'd my way out of the cage I believed I was in, and now that I had it, I realized too late that it wasn't freedom at all, but isolation. I was standing alone in the wreckage of my life, with no one left to share it with, and the high was gone. The thrill of rebellion was gone. Nothing but a distant memory. All I had left was the crushing weight of my choice, the reality of what I'd lost. I'd wanted something new, something more. And now, as I was looking at the empty, dark room, I knew that I had received exactly what I had requested, and it was the most lonely sensation in the world.